Good afternoon, Murat. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you again for being patient with us running late. I'm here in the Turkish Pavilion in the Vardiya exhibition with a group of 8 architecture students who are discussing what potential there is for architecture as a critical medium. And we are excited to hear about your project, which you'll be presenting at the Istanbul Design Biennale. I'm just going to read a bio for you quickly to introduce you. Ali Murat Cengiz is an architect and pianist who has been working on music as syntax for many years. Being introduced to the generative design ideas of architect and shape grammarist George Stinney, he was intrigued to find a way to design music in a similar fashion. After meeting linguist Ray Jackendoff, discussing his work with Fred Lerdal, taking lessons from Bart Soeters on projections, and meeting with cognitive scientist Funda Yildirim about automata theory, he started the collective Automata to explore the exciting territory of graphic scores and musical syntax. He's going to be the mediator and translator between the musicians and visual artists during the workshop that's going to take place at the Istanbul Design Biennale coming up. Thank you. We're going to mute our side while you're talking because otherwise the echo is too big.
Oh, okay. Hi everyone. Very nice to be here. I hope everything is going nice there as well. I'm Murat. As Nadine told, I studied architecture in Istanbul. I did my bachelor's in Yıldız Technical University, and I was in Istanbul Technical University doing computer-aided architectural design. Actually, that's when I started to get these ideas about syntaxes and generative design. And as you know, I mean, that's probably the biggest intersection why I'm doing this and why I'm in the Netherlands at the moment. I'd always been into music. I was a musician in Istanbul already. And I saw that the profession of architecture in general doesn't really let you do spontaneous things or improvising on the spot sort of things. And I realized I'm more into that in general, and I started doing my career as a musician instead, as a pianist in the Netherlands. So I came to the Netherlands again, and I started from scratch doing my bachelor's in Groningen. Now I finished my master's in Utrecht. And in the end, I realized the people I know are half designers and graphic designers and architects, and the other half is just musicians and composers and arrangers. And I've always been fascinated by the connection of these two in some sense. And I went back to the ideas I learned in computer-aided architectural design, especially in the case of George Stinney, who is a professor in MIT. And he's the father of the term, probably, more or less, with Gibbs, the shape grammars. And I realized because of this fundamental foundation, I'm just looking everywhere in patterns and syntaxes. Let it be paintings, let it be drawings, or let it be a narrative or a play by Shakespeare. I see patterns and the grammars that these patterns could have evolved from. So I'll show a very short visual of how the shape grammars work first, because that's the beginning point of our collective. Yes. So as you may see here, this is a very basic shape grammar. Actually, this is based on the Paladin villas in Italy. That's just starting with very small fundamental shapes. In this case is the square. Just making a rule of how the squares connect, and then taking out certain squares and taking out certain walls that divide these squares, you end up with a lot of options that come to you, and then you can pick which design you like. And this is the fundamental idea behind the grammars, that you pick fundamental shapes, basic shapes, you put them into very basic operations, and then you end up with complex shapes, as in the Chinese windows. As you see, the rule is super basic. You have a triangle and you divide it, then you divide it again and you divide it again in certain, I think in this case it's a golden ratio. And you end up with very complex looking and interesting designs. And the next level of this kind of thinking is taking something like this. First, starting, in this case, it's, as you see, these squares within squares within squares, but then adding a second layer, which then detects the triangles in these shapes, then running the same algorithm again and again, and again, ending with really complex shapes that you wouldn't guess yourself. But the nice thing about this process in general is it just generates you stuff to work on, to get inspired by. And what I realized is, after going through this and meeting also George Steiny himself, and I realized when I go around and look at things that are designed, I try to find in my head what could have been the starting shape or the starting grammar that created this end product. And then, especially after reading the Generative Theory of Tonal Music by Ray Jekindorf and Fred Lardell, where they discuss connections between language and music and how it could be generative, like Chomsky ideas, I said, why wouldn't this work in music? Why don't we take shapes and operate them and so and create new musical compositions? But the thing is, in general, in music, we don't really have shapes that we can agree on so much so. We have, of course, tonalities and chords and structures, but their meaning changes from context to context, person to person, so much. And I realized I need a third ingredient. So it could be like a subject, looking at something, going to a place. So you need an inspiration from a place or an idea, in any case, that then you can decide, okay, now the triangle for me, it means this. It represents this musical idea, and it comes together with the square, which is this musical idea, because it comes from this place or this movement or this ideology. So starting from this main concept, we started the collective automata. But before coming to that, I'll show you a bit of my graphical scores based on this. So in this case, what I was trying to do now in my professional practice as a composer is I try to work like this now in general, like just trying to group things in visual representation instead of traditional musical scores, and basically use them as roadmaps and transformation rules, so I can draw a graphical score and use it to create just more than one piece. You can look at this as a piano roll or any automated musical construct that you can just, you know, bind to any musical idea, and it would create you different musical results. This was maybe scale-wise a big one. This could be a suite or a etude, and let's see, in a different style, I tried many things. This is more like, if you're familiar with Ligeti's articulation, it's more of that you see the sound waves and shapes in general, and the musical ideas that they represent is described in a legend. Or it could be just a map for improvisation like this. This I made for a workshop in Groningen in Prince Claus Conservatorium, just giving it to the conservatory students to practice improvisation. So all these, let's say, the The red colors means the intervals of major thirds and sixths, and the blue color means the intervals of minor thirds and sixths, and finally the green color is the interval of perfect fourths and fifths. And the way the geometry is interlocked, it matters. So if they're apart, it's staccato, so the sounds are more apart. If they're just joined by a single point, then it's a normal joint, like listening to Bach, you hear this kind of note by note connection. Or if they are joined very much together, then it's legato, so the sounds go in and out of each other. Or if they're really on top of each other, it's legatissimo, which you can imagine by when you go to a piano and press a pedal, all the sounds start to converge into each other. So this was a map. This is a map, and why is it significant for me is I can just take this map, and with the instructions it gives me, I can go to many places. And the main difference of using some kind of notation like this compared to traditional notation is every time I sit down, I can improvise something different out of it, and it keeps my improvisational thinking open and fresh. From this, I said, so then why don't we go to the city, and why don't we analyze the city? Why don't we see the buildings and designs and try to get the rules out of the city and make graphic scores with the rules like Steiny did, and then go back to the musical practice and make music out of them. So I'll show you a short one. This is the Paulskerk in Rotterdam. It's a very fun, nice little design here. Also with the surrounding, it's quite a deconstructivist maybe, or postmodern design or interpretation of a church. It's made up of lots of triangle faces, and as you see, the main window, the main church window, the rose petal is also made of triangles. And it was a very interesting design, and whoever passed in front of it sort of remembers it, like what was it? What did I just pass in front of? So I took it. So this is also the more or less the handbook of how we are going to do it in the Istanbul Biennale. So finding a place of interest like this in the city, either design interest, or it can be a social or a cultural interest that this design or place provokes, and then trying to make some visual meaning out of it. That's the first part. So for me, this was, okay, I first started making some sketches. So for me, this was just triangles joining equal triangles, more or less, and they leave a bell in the middle. And then the main idea I took out of it was it's just a regular shape repeated again and again, but with irregular accesses and irregular repetition. So it is quite a translatable musical idea if I want to take it. So then I started to make a graphical score out of it. And that would be this. My idea was to sort of open up the church in a way that it turns into a timeline. And that's the most important part of doing this kind of visualization practice, because we are drawing things to be played. The most important thing we need to consider is we need to create time. Because if you look at a painting or a picture, the time is where your eye sits in and how your eye moves. But in music, there needs to be a linear time, otherwise music doesn't really exist. Only maybe after listening to the whole piece at once, and then you can say, you can go back in your head and say, yeah, the piece was like this, and I listened to this, and there was this again. But that's a whole different practice. So our main challenge is to make timelines out of these places we visit. So this was one part. And then I went to my musicians and I asked them, what do you think about this? How would you interpret a notation like this? And we had many discussions with different people. I had a baritone saxophone player from Sicily, Giuseppe Doronzo. I had a Turkish guitarist, Erdoğan Cem Evin. And then I had the Austrian bass player, Johannes Fan. They all took this score, and they had limited amount of time to interpret, like this was 1 minute and 50 seconds, to interpret this piece. And the only instruction I gave them is this is made by regular shapes, repeated irregularly, but there's of course also my own artistry involved visually that combines this into a timeline. This is one part. And the second part is this is only the visual world. This is only the world we see. But what happens when you go to a place and you want to really understand the place that you're in a city, but you don't want to look, but you want to listen? Because as musicians, you want to be also open to all kinds of sound possibilities as possible. I realized there isn't really much. It was a really funny experience, and I should also mention the past 2 years I have been working with a great pianist, Bert van der Brink, who is mostly known for his work with Toots Thielemans, but also as a musician is an incredible composer as well. And he's blind. He has perfect pitch, he has perfect rhythm, but he's blind, and I had the opportunity to help him around the city all the time after our lessons. I took him to the train station, I took him to a cafe, whatever he needs. I was the assistant, more or less. But of our discussions, this was also provoking me, like, what do you just hear? How do you understand where you are? And how can a place uniquely speak to you? And that was hard, and I made a huge list of what you can do to get from a place, because there's a lot of noise, as Bert told me, when you just try to listen to things. Like there are noises that exist everywhere. Car noises, sounds of people, in terms of the Netherlands, bicycle noises, of course. In terms of Istanbul, it will be cats and dogs as well, I presume. And out of these noises, you have to filter them out somehow and somehow just hear where you are. That's the hard part. And the other thing I realize is unless there's motion, there is no sound. So either you have to move yourself or even take a stick and just hit it around the place to understand the sound texture of the place, or you create sound yourself and just shouting around to hear how big the place is or what's the texture of where you're in. But in the end, all these things, especially like conversing with Bert about this in general, like, because also another remark he made was going around the Oudegracht in Utrecht, which is a big long canal with shops and very nice cafes. He said this place sounds like a cathedral, but it's open. So it's a church, but it's open. It's the same amount of people, the humidity, the amount of reverberation is the same. For me, it's just open air. So making these connections was super interesting. And on the other hand, I realized most of the basic design rules we learned in architecture, contrast, harmony, structure, balance, rhythm, repetition, transition, subordination, symmetry, and notes and lines, they all have meanings in music. So what happens if we go to the same place? We do our practice of these graphics scores, and also the musicians take out the audio space of where we are in, and we try to make up a concept together and then compose and play music. That would basically be the sum of all the projects, I guess.
There we go. There's hi, Murat. Are there any questions from?
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I think this was one of the most interesting presentations so far today. And I was wondering, how do you, like, when we look at the first sketches you showed us, it seemed a little bit, it had an organicism within it. For me, it looked like one of Kiesler's studies and sketches. I was wondering how you moved from those organic curves to the meshed geometries, and like when you were looking at this like surfaces in the architectural scale, how do you decide to unfold the facade? And did you ever think of looking at it as a volume rather than sets of surfaces?
Yeah, that was quite a possibility. First of all, the meshes helped me think in terms of scale and proportion easier. So that was an easy route to pick in the beginning. But on the other hand, especially smooth lines and circles in general provoke more musical ideas. That's my more personal idea. But when I was just considering to just take these, I found these notebooks with dots and only dots on it, and just taking it and trying to find out proportions and scales out of it. So the mesh part helps at least develop. And on the other hand, it's also, I think, especially the first one I showed, it resembles a bit of an automata the computer engineers use a lot. So it's just like a logic circuit where the program starts. Let's say it's an automatic door. It says if you see a person, open. If it's this close, close back. So it also follows this sort of direction. But on the other end, in the example I showed, I opened the facade of the building, but that didn't have to be. Like you said, it could be just experiencing inside, and it's just the volume, or creating a timeline just with yourself experiencing the building could be another story. But I want to leave it up to more to the designers and architects, and they can interpret the way they want to interpret this whole thing.
Did you try to abstract any cities or like any urban conditions, or were you just looking at?
I'm mostly now in small scale, so I can experiment easier. But that's totally a thing I want to go into later. So first starting on a small scale, then building up to a bigger scale.
Do you have an example of the sound that you?
Yeah, sure. But I don't know how it looks like. I can also send you a sound file if you want, but how should we do? I think this is too low. Now, Nadine, is it okay if I just send you the sound file so you play it?
Can you send it in the group chat here on this? You can see the window here. I think you can add files there.
All right. I can put a link, I think. Okay, I think I have a link anyway. Does this work?
I think the SoundCloud link might be private because it tells us it can't find it.
No. Then I change it. Can you try now?
Murat, we have to get out of the pavilion soon, but we have one last question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Hi, I have first a comment that I was noticing how the SoundCloud generates kind of spikes for the music and how that kind of correlates with your mapping of the building. And I thought that was really interesting. I'm just wondering if that's something that you notice happening. And then my other question was that have you looked at other genres of architecture? And like I think your work is amazing, and I think it would be really cool to see like an Ottoman building or something compared to a modern building, and how it's like I think it's a really amazing way to experience architecture that we don't really do. So I'm eager to see like more buildings represented this way.
The funny thing is, I'm playing in it and Giuseppe is playing in it, but we are not playing at the same time because I just sent him, you have 1 minute and 50 seconds and I have 1 minute and 50 seconds, and then I combine the two tracks together. So more or less we were able to follow the rules set by the visuals, but we were also thinking about the building and the experience we had around the building ourselves. But I didn't check the waveform. It's a good question. I should check it as well. And of course, traditional buildings are going to create more different ideas and inspirations, especially because of their history and more intricate details in general, I guess. But thanks for the remark.
Okay, thank you, Murat, so much for talking to us, and we're looking forward to seeing you in Istanbul. And they're going to, if I understand correctly, you're going to be doing a couple of interpretations of Istanbul buildings for the Design Biennale, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, and have a good evening.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.